welcome back. Like I said earlier, it's going to take me a few minutes. I had to come out here to the swamp, out here with a bunch of guys. We had a little meeting this morning where we discussed some issues that are going on here, specifically in South Carolina. But like I was saying earlier, we have a lot more issues along the Atlantic Flyway. Now, in order to understand the issues we're having today, we need to understand a little bit of history about how the migration has been affected. Now, back in the early days, if you look at some of the old maps, the migrations were pretty simple. You had the Atlantic Flyway, which the majority of the migration flew down the actual eastern seaboard. Then you had the Mississippi and Central Flyways, which flew down the Mississippi River Valley, and the Central Flyways, which come from the Great Plains, out of the Dakotas down into portions of Louisiana over to Texas. And then on the Pacific side, you had them coming from the Northwest Territories all the way down into California and into Mexico, down around Baja. And that's how majority of it was set up. Now, we know today that that isn't quite right, that we're actually seeing ducks from what we call crossovers. So how did that, if we had it back then and we just didn't see it then, so how do you say there's a change in migration? Well, let's take a look back, because we do know that back in the 1900s, the early 1900s, the majority of the ducks, the largest concentrations, came on the Atlantic Flyway, flew down the eastern seaboard, and they ended up in South Carolina, down on the South Carolina coast. A lot of that came about due to early rice plantations from the mid 1800s on, until sometime after the Civil Wars, when the majority of those rice farms quit production. There were still some there, but it had already quit production and had already gone out west, out towards Arkansas. Well, if the largest concentrations that came into South Carolina were along the coast, and we do know that ducks migrated west from the coast, where did they go? Because you see, the Santee lakes weren't here yet. They would migrate during high water years. So when these floods would hit the Santee swamps from the Congaree and the Wateree and the Santee and the upper Santee swamp where we're here today, these oak tree flats would start to flood and be filled with acorns, and that's what the ducks really, really wanted. So in the high water years, they would migrate westward up into this area. Now, how they know that it was a high water year is beyond me. I couldn't tell you. Now, in the early 1930s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt came out with this program called the New Deal. Everyone's heard about it. This is where he went around across the country and started making lakes and reservoirs. Now, these lakes and reservoirs the trees had to be cut. We just came out of a Great Depression. People needed work. They started logging trees out of the swamps to make these reservoirs. Then in the late 1930s, the late 1930s, a war was starting to loom over in Europe, World War II. Franklin Delano Roosevelt ordered the creation of the Santee Cooper Lakes, Lake Marion, Lake Moultrie. The dam was completed and the lake started to flood. At the same time, around 1941, the Santee National Wildlife Refuge was completed. Now, this refuge was originally designed for the wintering geese that came to South Carolina down the Atlantic Flyway. And this was their last stop. This was primarily their last stop. Oh, a few would go down to Georgia and into Florida. But for all practical purposes, this was the last stop. Now, how did those ducks know that we're on highest concentration were on from the coast? How did they know? Well, because we now know that we had ducks coming from the Great Lakes, the Prairie Pothole region, crossing through Tennessee, and then ending up into the Santee Cooper Lakes, or the Santee Cooper area. At the time, one time it was just vast swamps, now it's a lake. So we had this huge concentrations that were coming. Santee Cooper then became the last wintering stop for the Atlantic flyway mallard. Now, from 1941, we shoot up to about 1976. Now, in 1976, we had a decrease in population of mallard, or actually of ducks. It was down to 33.9 million birds was on the fall forecast. But yet we were still seeing a lot of ducks, and we were shooting a lot of ducks. I want you to think about this for a second. 40 years later, this lake started to go down. And what I mean about that, the vegetation started to decrease from the oak trees. These oak trees have been in the water for 40 years. Yes, they do produce, but they don't produce as much. And when you don't have a drawdown, there's a reduction in the acorn production. You won't see your ducks, and the other grasses that they needed has also been reduced because of it's been underwater for so long. So in the 1980s, we started seeing a decrease in ducks, a dramatic decrease. And what we were seeing, and we were even seeing higher numbers in the fall forecast, but the decrease because they weren't coming here. So, what has happened? Where are the ducks? If we're seeing a higher increase in the fall forecast, are they just paper ducks? Or are they real ducks? Or do we have a migration problem? That's what we need to figure out.
All right,
so we're starting to see a shift in the migration. But, we're going to back up just a second. You hear a lot of guys say when you don't have a good migration, it could be weather. It's always weather related. Well, weather, we can't control weather. But when we had fewer ducks, like in 1976, we were still seeing a lot of ducks. And what is causing this shift in migration? We all know what's happening. We see it every time we come out here. Well, I have a theory. In the mid-'80s, there were loopholes that were found in the Migratory Bird Treaty where people started to grow corn or other grain crops, beans, or even rice. And they would flood these fields without harvesting them. Now, in the past, they had always harvested their fields and then flooded the grain crop. But these loopholes, and it was very vague on these loopholes. There were some that were actually, some of the game wardens, the federal and state guys, even judges and whatnot, they didn't quite understand all the nuances of what was going on, and they didn't know how to enforce the baiting law. So there was a lot of loopholes that were found, and these areas started to get heavily, legally baited. Now, we all know that the refuges made cornfields. They planted corn, and they flooded these, and even some of the refuge on the waterfowl refuges, they would actually supplement the food by pouring corn out. Now, we do know this for a fact. Right after World War II, Crabtree Orchard Refuge out in Illinois, along with Swan Lake Refuge in Missouri, they planted these cornfields, and then they actually supplemented the cornfields by taking truckloads and truckloads and truckloads of corn. Now, we know this happened because it was in the news. Crabtree Orchard actually built grandstands, and the people would come from the cities to actually watch the migration of the Canada goose. Well, basically where a Canada goose goes, you know you're going to start seeing mallards. So if the Canada goose was stopping at the Crabtree Orchard and not going any further, then there is a migratory change right there. Because you see, that part of the flyway, on the central flyway, these Canada geese would actually migrate all the way down to Cameron Parish, Louisiana. That was their last stop. It wasn't just a few short years after the refuges, Crabtree Orchard and Swan Lake in Missouri started doing this by planting these cornfields and then supplementing with just tons and tons and tons of truckloads of corn, that the migration actually stopped in Louisiana, to the point in the 1950s they had to actually close down the Canada goose season for Louisiana. They just weren't getting enough birds. That migration had stopped. We commonly refer to that as a short stop, but in all actuality, it is a change in migration. Now, a lot of refuges across the country were doing the same thing. Refuges in Maryland, refuges in Delaware. Maryland complained that Delaware's refuges were short-stopping the birds. We were complaining that Maryland was short-stopping us. So they were doing this. This is happening all across the country. Now, these were all refuges, and in the big scheme of things were small areas. Another thing we have to remember is in Canada, you can legally bait there. All you have to do is buy a permit. So these private duck clubs were actually baiting their areas. All they had to do was purchase a bait permit. Now, in the big scheme of things, this wasn't really hurting us in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, even into the 70s, because it was just the refuges that were doing it. But in the 80s is when they started finding these loopholes. I think it was about around 1986 is when they found these loopholes. At this time, and being more specific, especially in South Carolina, is where you started seeing duck ponds being created. Now, even back then, these guys, they would buy a piece of property and they would actually build a duck pond. And they were just making their own little piece of duck heaven. That's what they were doing, and no one thought anything different. And because of these loopholes, they were able to build these ponds, plant corn, and then flood these corn ponds. Well, you say, well, that was just happening in South Carolina, but no, it wasn't. It was happening all up and down the Atlantic Flyway. These private landowners, they wanted their own little piece of duck heaven. And they would build ponds, or they would actually grow corn and then flood these fields, unharvested fields. Now, you take all the states in the Atlantic Flyway, you take all the states in the Mississippi Flyway and in the Central Flyway, and you start combining that now starts to become a lot of property, and a lot of property that is, for the most part, legalized baiting. Well, because the laws were so vague in the 80s, in 1998 and 1999, the Migratory Bird Treaty was actually changed. The wording was changed in the baiting laws, where it actually now became legal to plant corn fields or grain fields or build a pond and then flood it. It all became 100%, that vagueness was taken out. Now, in the 90s, now you start seeing a lot more of these cornfields, these unharvested cornfields start popping up. Well, a couple other things started happening at the same time. Now, I'm not knocking anyone down, and certainly not, but duck hunting in the late 90s, in the late 80s, started to become very, very popular again, and especially with the youth. And by the 1990s, it became a fad. It literally became a fad. Younger duck hunters were coming out. It became very, very popular. So now we've got a lot of people going on. Duck populations were still on the rise. Some years were lower than others, but it was still being very consistent. But we were seeing fewer and fewer numbers. And because duck hunting started becoming popular, the guiding outfits that would normally lease land and then flood harvested corn or harvested grain fields began purchasing land, to the point where there are some of these guiding outfits that have thousands and thousands of acres of flooded, unharvested corn. Now, to understand the impact of what harvested corn and unharvested corn can do, a study was conducted, and it was named the Daily Usage Ducks, or the DUD. Now, that study was done, I believe, by Delta, which pretty much states that an unharvested cornfield that is flooded per acre, 1 acre, can hold up to 2,000 ducks a day. That's a lot of ducks for 1 acre of unharvested corn. Whereas that same acre, had it been harvested, would only harbor about 200 ducks. So you see the difference? The landowners on these private duck clubs and these guiding outfits, they see that as a win. They can grow this corn, they can hold ducks. They put 1,000 acres to the side, flood that unharvested corn, and they can hold ducks for quite a long time. See, ducks can take a lot of weather, and everybody says that weather pushes ducks. Well, it does to some extent, but we've all seen the pictures. Ducks on ice. I know it sounds funny. It sounds like a little skating rink, doesn't it? But we've all seen these flooded fields, these flooded ponds, completely iced over, unharvested corn crop, ducks standing on top of the ice reaching up to get the corn. Because all a duck needs is food, water, and rest. And trust me, there is going to be some open water. Now, we know ducks will fly a long way to get food, and we know they'll fly a long way to get water. So flying 50 miles to find open water is nothing. So if there's an ice line in a frozen pond, and let's say, for example, just to give you kind of an idea, let's just say that this out here is a flooded corn pond, and it's completely iced over. But just south of me, 50 miles away, it is warm enough that the water's not frozen. Well, it's nothing for a duck to get up, fly 50 miles, eat corn, and in the afternoon fly the 50 miles back to the open water. And really, how cold does it have to get to freeze everything up? A lot cold. I'm talking some serious Arctic blast. Although weather, and I will consent, although weather does play a part, food plays a much bigger part. And with these cornfields, these unharvested cornfields and ponds, gives these ducks a lot of carbohydrated foods. And they can just sit up there and not move. This does a couple of things. Again, it stops the migration, a change in migration. Now let's go back to the Atlantic Flyway. If all these places in the Central and Mississippi Flyway have all these acres and acres, thousands and thousands of acres, see, we get a lot of our ducks from there. We get ducks as far away as the Northwest Territory. We get ducks out of Alberta and Saskatchewan. We get ducks out of the Great Lake region. We get ducks out of eastern Ontario and all of Quebec, along with Prince Edward and Nova Scotia. So you see, it's just not ducks coming down from the eastern seaboard. It's ducks coming from everywhere. Those western ducks fly down, cut across Tennessee, and end up right out here in Santee. If those fields are holding ducks, is one of the reasons we're not seeing ducks. Therefore, they're short stopping or changing the migration. Little food for thought. Just a little bit food of thought. So is the migration changing, or is it all about weather? Again, I'm telling you, it all plays a part. And I'm going to leave you with this thought real quick. Some of you younger hunters, talking to the older hunters. And those older hunters will tell you, years ago, it was cold. It was a lot colder. We had a lot more ducks. Yep, I'm one of those older hunters. And all we had a pair of blue jeans, rubber and canvas waders. We had a whole canvas duck's back jacket. We were lucky if we had a pair of gloves that they were warm in the summer. Trust me, they were never warm in the winter. We didn't have Mr. Buddy heaters. We didn't have these fancy, breathable, quilted waders or these nice fleece-lined jackets. We had a little bit of wool, a lot of cotton. That's what we had. So yeah, it was colder back then. You're warmer now because you got all this other gear, this Gore-Tex and all this fleece. And yeah, I walk to school every day in the snow all year long, uphill both ways. Yeah, think about that. Somebody's pulling your leg. I'm Matt. This is Daddy Duck 365, and we'll see you next time.